Hey everybody, I'm Rob Terrio from Ontario, and this talk is about case-based learning in the digital age. And just by way of background, I've been a paramedic for 35 years. I've been teaching full-time for the last 20 years, and I've used quite a few different technologies in teaching and learning for my students, ranging from podcasting, screencasting, webcasting, asynchronous online learning, synchronous online learning, and more recently I've been exploring virtual and augmented reality with my students. So I really like doing case-based learning with my students, and there are so many really good resources available on smartphones and tablets that students can harness to use in case-based learning. And so I'm going to go over some ideas around applications that you can use in case-based learning, and hopefully give you some ideas, perhaps things you haven't thought about in the past. So, even today, under the current circumstances with COVID-19, there's opportunity to do case-based learning via webcast, or providing students with cases asynchronously that they can review, and then when you meet with them live online via whatever platform you happen to be using, you can engage them in discussion about cases, which is generally much more engaging, interesting, and much more likely to result in actual learning than perhaps giving a lecture, as I'm ironically doing right now. Excuse me. So there are a number of applications available on smartphones and tablets that I'm hesitant to recommend any specific ones, but let me just talk about them fairly broadly. But under categories, I think it's essential that students have a calculator, obviously, if they're doing any sort of calculation, especially if they're at the EMT Advanced or EMTP level. If you're going to use reference apps, I would just choose them carefully. I'll talk about those in a minute. So there are a number of drug apps we're going to look at. Differential diagnosis app, reader apps or medical directive apps are valuable as a category. QR scanners, I'll talk about why I use QR codes in my case-based learning. And ebooks is a consideration, or different references for students. Also things like emergency response guides, right? Which most of which are available for free. So just to give you a sense of what I do personally for case-based learning, this is just a portion of a page of a case. So I create a case, and I've got hundreds of them, and it's a two-sided page. And I mentioned QR codes. One of the reasons I use QR codes is it saves me some real estate, and I'll explain that in just a minute. So the details of this particular case are not particularly important, but just know that the students have a case in front of them, either paper or a digital copy. And medical apps are really important because they can continue to use these in the field. I can remember not that long ago, actually, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, some of us were still carrying pocket drug guides, and they're heavy, and by the time you purchase them, they're already out of date. So now we're quite fortunate to have a number of different apps, and as the instructor, I think it's important for you to take a look at the apps and decide which ones are most appropriate for students, because some of them are designed for healthcare providers, some of them are designed for the layperson. So you certainly don't want them to look at a drug reference that's designed for the layperson, because it really won't give them the information they need. Now, and I know that most patients don't know their medical history, right? They, they'll tell you things like, you'll ask, do you have high blood pressure? And they'll say no. And they'll say no for a couple of reasons, or possible reasons. Either they don't know, they just, don't pay a lot of attention to what their family doctor tells them, or their perception is that they don't have blood pressure because their blood pressure is good. But you look at their medications and realize they're on 1, 2, or 3 antihypertensive drugs. So in their mind, they don't have high blood pressure because it's being treated. In your mind, they do have high blood pressure because it's being treated. So obviously, it's important for students, whether EMT level or EMTP level, to know most of the garden variety prescription meds, so they can look at them at a glance and know roughly what sort of medical history they're dealing with. So this is one drug app that I like. It's free, and I promised myself I wouldn't plug any particular drug apps. Let me see if I can get this working here. There we go. So here's an old drug some of you probably haven't seen for a while, digoxin. But these drug apps are really easy to use. Now, what I tell my students is that if the service that they're working for when they graduate allows for them to use their own phone or the company phone for looking up information, when you're sitting in the back of the ambulance, I think it's important to convey to students that they need to inform the patient what they're doing with their phone, because as a patient, it would probably be annoying to look over at your paramedic and see that he's or she is on their phone thinking they're looking at social media or something. So as a medic, I would just say to the patient, I'm just looking at the medication you're on, just as a courtesy. Oops, so let me go back here. So here I've got this part of the case presentation. There's a set of vitals and a second set of vitals. And I really like QR codes. And if you use Google or Chrome, there are a number of QR code generators available for free. And so what I do is I use these QR codes to link students to images or videos or quizzes, and I use Google Forms quite often for quizzes. And this saves me a lot of real estate. So if I want them to see a 12-lead ECG or just an ECG rhythm strip or an image of a car crash, if we're talking about kinetics of injury, or GSW, if we're talking about ballistics, then they've got that through a QR scanner. And I use, I used to use Dropbox, but I stopped using that when they got rid of their public folders. But I use OneDrive, I use Google Docs, and you may have some other ideas about storage for files, but you can use any one of a number of different storage sites on the web. So just as an example, in our paramedic lab, we have a bunch of empty pill bottles, and they have a name typed on one side and a QR code on the other. So in a scenario, for example, the students will be given a handful of pill bottles, and they'll be expected to look at them and know from looking at them that this patient is a non-insulin dependent diabetic, that they have hypertension, hyperlipidemia, gout, for example, and if they're not able to identify the medication at a glance, then they can scan the QR code in the back and find that information. So we did a little interprofessional collaboration exercise with our pharmacy tech program. So the pharmacy tech students wrote up a single-page description of the 200 most common prescription drugs. I created the QR codes for each one. It was very labor intensive. It took me many hours to do it. And then we put them on these pill bottles. I'll just tell you that because of the nature of the cylinder shape of the pill bottle, you have to get just the right QR code size in order to make it scannable. If it's too small, it's not scannable. If it's too big, it sort of goes around the curve and it's not scannable. And it took me a long time to get just the right size, just so you know. So there are a number of different QR scanners. This one's called Scan that I've used in the past. If you've got an iOS device, see, here's a scanner going over the QR code, takes you to an ECG in this case. If you've got an iOS, you just have to hold the camera to the QR code. You don't have to tap it or anything, and it creates a link into Safari. So this is when I was posting ECGs on one of the storage sites, and you can look at the ECG in more detail, which is very cool. So a differential diagnosis app is good to have. I'm not sure if this one is still actually available. It still works on my phone. And I'm a big fan of e-textbooks, but very few students are fans of e-textbooks at this point, but I am. In fact, We don't even use a paramedic textbook anymore. I just provide my students with a whole series of resources, videos, reading materials, and I've just sort of accumulated and narrated those over the years on a Google Doc, and I provide my students with a link to that Google Doc because I find the textbooks are just too expensive, at least for paramedic material. That's my personal opinion. Our education system in Canada is a little bit different. So we have a 2-year primary care paramedic program, a 3rd year for advanced care, and a 4th year for critical care. And in the entry level in the 2-year college program, the students have got to get an individual pathophysiology book, an anatomy book, a pharmacology book, and there isn't a paramedic textbook that goes to the necessary depth and breadth in those areas for us. So because they've got to spend so much money on those other books, I've just foregone a paramedic book, and I give them resources. Ebooks, differential diagnosis app, great stuff. This is the differential diagnosis app I was talking about. The thing I like about this, so I type in chest, and then it shows me chest pain, and I tap on that, and it gives me a choice between life-threatening causes and most common causes, which is great. And hopefully the students get to know those often enough, and the key is in scenarios to quiz them on it. So in the lab, when you're doing scenarios, to ask them what's your differential diagnosis. That's the approach to take. Otherwise, they just rely completely on these apps. Oops, let me go back here. So I mentioned the calculator app. That's essential if they're doing drug dose calculations, and some sort of app for accessing their medical directives. If you're going to use something like a pediatric reference app, I would recommend that you make sure that the drug dosages are consistent with the local medical directives, because that can be a problem otherwise. And students need to know this for their own liability as well when they're working in the field. So this is a bit of a short presentation, but just sort of to wrap up, the other thing that's a lot of fun with case-based learning is to use some sort of monitor app. Now, if you have access to iSimulate, that's fantastic, and you can do cases and show them, ECG and respiratory rate and end-tidal CO2 and SpO2 and so on, and manipulate it from a second monitor. If you're in COVID-19 mode and you don't have access to that, there are some inexpensive and some free monitors available through smart devices that you can use, and I've used those numerous times. So lots and lots of available resources in terms of doing case-based learning digitally. And in summary, I would just say that remember that using applications is part of the student's everyday life, and they may not be as digitally savvy as we think they are. I would never make that assumption. They may be digitally savvy for certain things, but not necessarily for things related to medicine or paramedicine. And so digital literacy or teaching digital literacy is important, and we have a responsibility to show them how to find credible applications and credible information on the internet, and that's not difficult to do. Important to be able to harness those resources available on through applications and various other sources, again with the caveat that we have to consider local policy. So some services may not permit paramedics or EMTs to use their own cell phone, for example. So are they using a company cell phone to patch with a base hospital physician, or and does that phone have applications that they have access to? I think it's unfortunate that some services ban the use of personal phones. I think we need to drag ourselves into the 21st century and acknowledge the fact that people will do that. But with the caveat that it's important to convey to the patient that that's what we're doing, that we're not, so that their perception is we're not off on social media. And I didn't mention this in the discussion about use of applications for case-based learning, but the other thing I would just add to this is that I try to stress the importance in the beginning of my program with my students of developing a peer learning network. And part of that peer learning network would be to start listening to podcasts. And, we're really fortunate. We're in a day and age where some of the most brilliant minds in medicine and paramedicine and nursing and other professions are available through podcasts. And there are lots of case-based learning applications in podcasts that students can subscribe to. I also podcast all of my classes. I talk about podcasting separately for this conference, and so I make that available to them through Spotify and other platforms. And this is a great learning tool for pushing them further than they might otherwise get within their program, and gives them things to listen to and learn from, and information they can take back to the classroom and bring questions about the information they've learned. So lastly, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to present, and for good or worse, this was a short presentation, and hopefully I have some questions afterwards.